Maxine Margolis is Professor Emerita at the University of Florida and Senior Research Scholar, Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. Like Brian Ferguson, who I interviewed previously, Professor Margolis was a student of Marvin Harris, and her work is informed by his preferred research strategy, cultural materialism. I spoke to Professor Margolis about her career and her work with Marvin Harris. The interview has been edited for clarity and brevity. Margolis wrote the introduction to the updated edition of Marvin Harris's most important scholarly work, The Rise of Anthropological Theory, A History of Theories of Culture. She wrote, quote, "Although The Rat is not an easy book to read, it would undoubtedly make any list of classics in anthropology," unquote. She also said that the book's, quote, "most enduring achievement is its introduction of cultural materialism as a theoretical paradigm and novel research strategy," unquote. I asked Maxine Margolis to talk about her introduction to cultural materialism, her evolving relationship with Marvin Harris, first as a student and graduate student, and then later as a colleague who campaigned to bring him from Columbia to the University of Florida.
Marvin, I took his course in the history of anthropological theory, maybe my second year in graduate school. I just, I inhaled cultural materialism. It just always seemed to me the best way of explaining behaviors cross-culturally. When we went in Brazil, he was kind of in charge of the graduate students. And we were in Salvador, Bahia, which in the old quarter has a lot of cobblestones. And I remember going out for dinner with Harris and other students, and I was wearing heels, but like little tiny heels, and was having trouble walking on the cobblestones. And he told me I walked like a crippled chicken. I've seen him be rant and rave at students. I mean, usually over theory, not personal, He's very set in his ideas, and he was willing to espouse them and defend them in strong terms. And he never, other than the crippled chicken remark, he never said anything bad to me. I mean, I always, and after he came to Florida, it was a huge campaign. There were people in my department who did not, in no way wanted him there. And we had a secret group meeting, plotting, how is this one going to vote? How is that one going to vote? How's the third one going to vote? And we really, it was like a political campaign. And we won, and he came. It was a great coup. But none of the candidates was anywhere, I don't remember who they were anymore, but none of them had the stature of Marvin. It was ridiculous. And Marvin came, and he mellowed. That's the word I want. He really mellowed. He got along with people, even who he didn't agree with theoretically. And he got along fine.
Dr. Margolis is the author of many books on culture and gender, including Mothers and Such, Views of American Women and Why They Changed, published in 1984. She has just published in 2020, Women in Fundamentalism, Modesty, Marriage, and Motherhood, where she compares three distinct patriarchal cultures. The cultures she discusses are fundamentalist communities which represent extreme examples of the world's major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
I had been noticing these really striking parallels in the treatment of women and ideas about women in three very distinct fundamentalist communities. Polygamous Mormons in the Southwest U.S., another Brooklyn Hasidim, and the third one, which are not a religious, they're Muslims, in fact, the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, which are the Pashtun, who practice a brand of Islam, what I would call fundamentalist Islam, on top of their tribal traditions, which are extremely misogynistic. They're patriarchal in the extreme. And all three cases, that's true. Women are the brood mares. That's the title of one of the chapters. Well, I think the catalyst for the treatment in all three cases is this emphasis on reproduction. For the Satmar and other Hasidim, it is in part an answer to Hitler. And there's power in numbers. The Rebbe tells them who to vote for. The prophet tells them who to vote for. They vote in lockstep. And they're both very successful at getting food stamps, all kinds of, you name it, they get it.
I also spoke to Professor Margolis about her work on Brazilian studies. She's written about Brazilian immigrants in books such as Little Brazil, an ethnography of Brazilian immigrants in New York City, which was published in 1994, and An Invisible Minority, Brazilian Immigrants in New York City. That book was reviewed in the June 2011 edition of The Latin Americanist by Nai Afalabi, who said, quote, Margolis has given us a true classic in migrational dynamics and politics as it affects Brazilians, unquote. In the next clip, Dr. Margolis also discusses the racial classification system of Brazil and how it is very different from the one used in the United States.
In 2013, I published a book called Goodbye Brazil, Emigres from the Land of Soccer and Samba, which was also published in Portuguese the same year. And it is based partly on my own research in New York on Brazilian immigrants, which was published in a book called Little Brazil in '94, but also after I was the first person to study Brazilian immigrants. Nobody knew there were Brazilian immigrants. And they called me the mãe de imigrantes brasileiros, the mother of Brazilian immigrants, better than the grandmother of Brazil. Since I did the original work in the early 90s, there have been all kinds of research on not only on Brazilians in the U.S. and various parts, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, California, but also in Japan. There is a huge Brazilian immigration of Japanese Brazilians, people of Japanese descent who are there legally, which is a whole other story about race, which is kind of interesting. But so this last book on Brazilian immigration, was a compilation of all this research that has been done on Brazilian immigrants in terms of all kinds of themes, in terms of social class and identity, and race, of course, is always an issue. How race is seen and how Brazilians are received in the U.S. and what are they? Been a lot of research on that, actually. How Brazilians perceive themselves. You know, in Brazil, one drop doesn't mean anything, but I have my current student, Fernanda, who's getting a PhD at Teachers College, Columbia, would be definitely considered African-American, Afro-Brazilian. She's she's a mulatta. So Brazilians find that, well, maybe they're not really as white as they thought they were in Brazil because of any admixture of any kind. There's an expression in Brazil, somebody has a pé na cozinha, a foot in the kitchen. That means somebody has some African ancestry. You know, Africans worked in the kitchens of whatever. According to Gilberto Freire, who's a famous Brazilian anthropologist, Brazil was a racial paradise. Well, that's been shown to be in error. However, it is indeed true, Brazil never had a history of legal segregation. The way of defining race in Brazil is very different from the U.S. There is no one-drop rule in Brazil. Brazil has always classified people by two things: how they looked, so that full brothers and sisters could be classified differently in terms of race if one was lighter skinned and the other was darker skinned. So how people look, not who their parents are, now less grandparents, but also socioeconomic status. Darker people tend to be poorer in Brazil. Lighter people tend to be wealthier in Brazil. People who are mulattoes, who are mixed race, tend to be seen as lighter if they are educated and of higher social class. And Brazil has many, many racial categories, not two, like in the U.S. And something like 40 different racial terms in use in Brazil based on how people look, their features, their hair type, their skin color, their lip type, etc. And there are, all, as I said, all kinds of combinations. And what's this consciousness of race, I think, as an American, is much less in Brazil than in the U.S. I think what Harris's analysis in patterns of race in the Americas is accurate. You had very different demographics. In Brazil, slaves always outnumbered Portuguese. Free people of color outnumbered Portuguese. And until the late 19th century, when you had an influx of immigrants to Brazil from Europe, people of color, and that's the term that's used in Brazil as the general category, gente de cor, which literally means gente is people, de cor of color. You know, they'll say preto, which means black, but they don't use that very much. But I think the bottom line difference is the difference in demographics. Even in I guess, Mississippi, which had the highest percentage of African American slaves of any place, even there they were a minority, whereas that was never true in Brazil. So the way free people of color were treated in Brazil was very different in the U.S.
Thanks to Maxine Margolis for the interview and for her work in anthropology on gender and Brazil. This is Nancy McClernand for Pinkerite. You can also find Pinkerite at pinkerite.com and on Twitter at Pinkerite1. Thanks for listening.